Jacob Reed was not the type to enjoy surprises. Ever since he opened his first snack bar 15 years ago, every detail of his business had been meticulously planned. He knew the cost of every ingredient, kept track of customer reviews, and made it a point to visit some locations in person. But lately, something seemed off. Reports indicated that sales were stable and managers insisted everything was going well. However, complaints about long waits, overworked attendance, and an increasingly unwelcoming environment began to multiply. So, Jacob did what any truly committed leader would do. He decided to see for himself. To avoid being recognized, he let his beard grow, swapped his well-tailored suits for worn jeans and a simple jacket. If he wanted honest answers, he needed to become just another regular customer. 2 hours of driving took him to a suburban town where one of his chain's units was located. It was a small corner restaurant with signs a bit faded by time. From the outside, it didn't look disastrous, but Jacob knew that what really mattered was what was inside. Upon entering, the smell of frying and hot coffee filled the air, and he soon realized that the place was quieter than it should be. The service wasn't chaotic, but it lacked life, that lively atmosphere of a place where people enjoyed being. His gaze landed on a red-haired waitress, wearing a slightly crumpled apron, moving from one side to the other with the urgency of someone who knew she wouldn't get a break. She smiled at the customers, but in moments of distraction, her face would tighten with exhaustion. Jacob sat at a corner table, from where he could observe everything without attracting attention. He took out the menu and pretended to read it, but his attention was on something else, the dynamics of the place. He noticed that the waitress, whose badge read Megan, was serving practically on her own. There was a young man in the kitchen whom he assumed was the cook, and a cashier who appeared to only process payments. The manager, on the other hand, didn't lift a finger. Tall, with broad shoulders and a perpetually irritated expression, he stood behind the counter like a prison guard, watching everything without getting involved. And when he spoke, he always shouted. Megan was balancing a tray with 2 cups of coffee when Rick, the manager, snapped his fingers to call her. She tried to respond without losing her balance, but was interrupted. "I'm talking to you. Megan, or have you gone deaf?" The way he treated her was so aggressive that some customers exchanged uncomfortable looks. Jacob felt his stomach churn. The waitress, visibly embarrassed, shook her head and rushed to answer the call, leaving the tray on the table of a couple who watched her with empathy. Rick pointed to a customer waiting at the counter and fired, "Why is this order delayed? Do you think you're on vacation?" Megan tried to explain that there were more tables than she could handle, but Rick didn't even let her finish. "I don't want excuses. I want you to work properly. Or do you want me to find someone who does?" Megan's face turned red, and she only nodded, lowering her head and returning to work. Jacob didn't know what was worse, the way Rick spoke to her, or the fact that Megan was clearly accustomed to that kind of humiliation. He scanned the restaurant and realized that this was not an isolated incident. The cashier avoided looking at the manager. The cook worked silently, and the customers seemed uncomfortable with the heavy atmosphere. What bothered Jacob most was that this was not just a management problem. It was a problem of respect. Jacob spent the next few minutes simply observing, trying to understand how far the situation would go. Megan ran back and forth, balancing plates and taking orders without pause, while Rick seemed to take pride in his stance as a merciless boss. When a customer raised their hand to call someone, Rick simply ignored it. Jacob saw Megan notice the call and hurry to serve, but before she could reach the table, Rick grabbed her arm. "Where do you think you're going? You haven't finished cleaning the table in the corner." The girl opened her mouth to say something but gave up. She turned around and began to clean the table in a rush, her movements hurried and tense. The frustrated customer huffed and folded their arms, waiting. Jacob felt a lump forming in his throat. That place didn't even remotely resemble the welcoming restaurant he had envisioned for his chain. The atmosphere was not only cold, it was oppressive. What caught his attention the most, however, was the cook. Connor, according to his badge, had something different. While Megan was crushed by the pace and the fear of making a mistake, Connor seemed determined to ease the situation. Even from the kitchen, he tried to help as best as he could, speeding up orders and, whenever possible, directing encouraging glances at Megan. Every now and then, when Rick wasn't around, he would murmur a few quick words to her, which seemed to give her some strength. Jacob realized that Connor not only saw the problem, he wanted to fix it. But like everyone else there, he was walking on eggshells. He looked at Rick as if he knew that one wrong step could cost him his job, and that was what Jacob needed to understand. He had come there because he felt something was wrong. Now, he not only knew what it was, but he also needed to decide what to do about it. Jacob knew he needed to stay calm. If he revealed who he was at that moment, he could scare the employees and wouldn't be able to understand the true extent of the problem. So he decided to wait. He ordered a hamburger and a soda just as an excuse to remain there longer. When Megan brought his order, he noticed the tension in her shoulders, as if she was always expecting the next attack. "Thank you," he said genuinely. Megan blinked, surprised, and murmured "You're welcome," before hurrying off to attend another table. It was subtle, but Jacob noticed no one there was used to receiving kindness. He continued eating while analyzing every detail. The pace of the restaurant was a disaster. The kitchen was overloaded, the service was slow, and worse of all, the atmosphere was suffocating. He saw Rick pointing a finger at the face of a cashier employee, saw Megan stumble in her haste, and instead of receiving help, be reprimanded again. The restaurant was sinking, and if this was the reality there, how many other units would be in the same state? Then something happened. Megan disappeared for a few minutes, and Jacob found her in the kitchen, leaning against the wall, taking deep breaths as if trying to hold back tears. He stood still for a moment, not knowing if he should approach, until he heard footsteps. Rick entered the kitchen and, without ceremony, threw a stack of plates into the sink. "If you can't handle the service, then ask to leave. I don't have time to deal with incompetence," he said, before leaving without waiting for a response. Megan closed her eyes, as if trying to hold herself together. Jacob felt his blood boil. This went beyond bad management. Rick not only ignored the problems, he created them. Jacob needed all his willpower not to intervene at that moment. But he knew that if he wanted to resolve this once and for all, he needed to act strategically. The next morning, Jacob returned to the restaurant in the same disguise. He knew he needed more information before acting. If Rick was a problem in that unit, how many other managers might be destroying the company culture without his knowledge? This time, he chose to sit at the counter, where he could observe everything up close without seeming suspicious. Megan and Connor were there, both looking exhausted even before the day had really started. He noticed that the girl avoided crossing paths with Rick as much as possible, while Connor seemed more reserved than the day before, as if he already knew that this shift wouldn't be easy. Jacob decided to approach. He waited for a moment when Megan was organizing the cutlery at the counter and said softly, "Has this job always been this hard, or has it gotten worse recently?" She hesitated, as if afraid to answer, but perhaps due to the casual way he asked, she ended up letting out a small sigh and murmured, "Ever since Rick arrived, everything has gotten 10 times worse." Connor, who was close enough to hear, cleared his throat and added, "He makes it a point to make everything unbearable." Jacob noticed that they exchanged quick looks, as if they had already discussed this before. He didn't need to ask anything further. The look of exhaustion on their faces spoke for itself. Rick was not just a bad manager. He was the kind of leader who crushed any attempt at motivation, someone who made the work environment unbearable. And if Megan and Connor were still there, it wasn't out of loyalty to the company, it was because they needed the job. Shortly after, the restaurant began to fill up for lunch. The pace was higher, orders piled up, and Megan and Connor rushed to keep up with the service. But the chaos wasn't just coming from the demand, it was coming from Rick. With every small mistake, he raised his voice, humiliating the employees in front of the customers. Megan tried to maintain her composure, but she was on the brink. Then, what Jacob had feared happened. A customer complained that the hamburger was wrong. It was a simple problem to resolve, but Rick didn't miss the opportunity to turn it into a spectacle. He crossed the restaurant with heavy steps and turned to Megan, pointing his finger at her face. "Do you have any idea of the damage your incompetence is causing? If you can't even take an order right, maybe it's better for you to look for another job." The ensuing silence was deafening. Megan was frozen, eyes wide, holding a plate as if she didn't know what to do. The customer, visibly uncomfortable, tried to intervene. "Look, there's no need for that. I just want my order right." But Rick ignored him. He loved the power he had there, loved watching others shrink in his presence. And it was at that moment that Jacob decided he had seen enough. He got up slowly, placed his napkin on the table, and walked over to them. His voice came out firm, without hesitation. "I think that's enough, Rick." The manager turned, frowning, ready to shout at another employee. But when his eyes met Jacob's, something changed. He realized that this was not just any customer. Rick opened his mouth to respond, but Jacob didn't give him time. "You enjoy humiliating your employees in public, don't you? Let's see how you handle being exposed in front of everyone." The entire restaurant was watching. Megan still held the plate, frozen, while Connor observed the scene with a mix of shock and hope. Rick laughed, crossing his arms. "And who the hell do you think you are to talk to me like that?" It was then that Jacob straightened up, leaving his casual posture behind. "I'm Jacob Reed, the owner of this chain." The air seemed to be sucked out of the room. The silence was absolute. Rick blinked, stunned, while Megan almost dropped the plate. Connor's eyes widened. The customers exchanged looks, realizing they were witnessing something much bigger than a simple dispute. Rick tried to laugh again, but his confidence had evaporated. Look, Mr. Reed, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I was just trying to keep the restaurant efficient." Jacob took a step forward. "Efficiency." He looked at Megan, then at Connor. "Treating employees like trash is not efficiency. Making the environment a living hell is not leadership." He turned to Rick, who was now sweating. "You're fired. Now." Rick turned red, opening and closing his mouth like a fish out of water. For a moment, Jacob thought he might try to argue, but something in his look made it clear that there was no way out. Without another word, Rick grabbed his keys and slammed the door as he left. The restaurant remained silent for a few more seconds, until, discreetly, someone started clapping. Soon, other customers joined in. Megan covered her mouth with her hand, still unable to believe what had just happened. Jacob waited for the murmuring to subside before turning to Megan and Connor. "Can you tell me everything now?" His voice wasn't that of a boss demanding explanations, but of someone genuinely willing to listen. Megan was still processing what had happened, but Connor was the first to speak. "This has been going on for months. He yells, humiliates, threatens to fire everyone over anything. Some have already quit, but most stay because they need the salary." Megan nodded, her voice still hesitant. "We try to keep the restaurant running, but sometimes it seems impossible." Jacob closed his eyes for a moment. What bothered him most wasn't just what Rick had done, but the fact that no one, not even the customers, had felt entitled to intervene before. It was as if everyone had accepted that toxic environment as normal. "That changes now," he said firmly. Connor exchanged a quick glance with Megan, as if he couldn't fully believe it. "But what about the next manager? How do we know it won't be the same?" Connor's question made Jacob reflect. He was right. If he just hired someone without a plan, he could end up putting another Rick in charge. So, he made a decision right then. "First, I'll hire someone who knows how to lead, not shout. Second, I need someone in here to help with this transition." He looked directly at Connor. "What do you think about becoming the assistant manager?" The young man's eyes widened. "Me," Jacob nodded. "You care about this place. I know you'll do everything to make it work." Connor looked at Megan, who smiled for the first time that day. He swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm in." Jacob spent the rest of the afternoon in the restaurant, observing and listening to the employees. Without Rick there, the atmosphere seemed to breathe, but there was still much to be done. He called Megan and Connor to talk about immediate changes. First, no more exhausting shifts. Everyone needs decent breaks. Megan let out a sigh of relief, as if she were finally hearing something she'd long expected. "And I'll reinforce the team. You can't do the work of 3 people." Connor nodded, already seemingly calculating in his head how the new dynamic would work. But Jacob knew that just operational adjustments wouldn't solve everything. The real problem went beyond the workflow. It was the restaurant's culture. He wanted people to feel valued, respected, and that meant changing the way the team was treated. "And you," he said, looking at Megan, "need to be rewarded for what you've endured here." Megan frowned, confused. "Me?" Jacob nodded. "Your salary will increase, and anyone who works hard here should be recognized." Megan took a moment to process, as if she had never considered such a possibility. "Thank you," she murmured, with a genuine smile. Jacob realized that this simple gesture meant more than any motivational speech. He turned to Connor. "Tomorrow morning I'll bring the new manager. I want you two to help ensure that he's the right person." Connor pounded his chest with a closed fist, jokingly. "If it's another Rick, I'll kick him out myself." Jacob laughed. For the first time since he had arrived, he felt that things were on the right track. The next morning, Jacob returned to the restaurant, this time accompanied by Denise, the new manager. She had years of experience and an impeccable track record, but more importantly, she had the demeanor he wanted, firm yet respectful. As soon as they entered, Connor and Megan were organizing the dining room, and the other employees seemed less tense than the day before. When Jacob introduced Denise, he saw the skeptical looks on Megan's and Connor's faces. They had reason to doubt, but he needed to show that the change was real. "I know you've been through a lot here," Denise said, looking directly at them. "My job is to ensure that this never happens again." There was an honesty in the way she spoke that made Megan relax a bit. Connor folded his arms and evaluated the new manager before nodding. "We'll see," he said with a half smile. Jacob stayed in that unit for a few more days, ensuring that the changes were being implemented. With the team reinforced, service became faster. Customers began to notice the difference and, most importantly, the employees no longer seemed to be walking on broken glass. Gradually, Megan began to regain the sparkle in her eyes, and Connor, now assistant manager, looked more confident than ever. During a quiet moment between shifts, Megan approached Jacob while he was reviewing some reports. "Thank you," she said, and this time her voice was not laden with exhaustion, but with genuine gratitude. "For the first time I feel that someone truly cares." Jacob closed his folder, smiled and replied, "Because I do care, and I always should have." On the last day before returning to his office, Jacob arrived early at the restaurant and observed everything from a distance, without interfering. It was almost unbelievable how different the atmosphere already seemed. Denise was commanding the team with firmness, yet with respect. Connor was already starting to take on assistant manager responsibilities, helping to coordinate shifts. Megan, now more confident, worked without the constant fear that once haunted her, and most surprisingly, the customers seemed to notice. The restaurant was busier, smiles were reappearing, and even the energy of the place had changed. For the first time in a long while, Jacob felt that his company was on the right track again. As he prepared to leave, Connor approached, wiping his hands on his apron. "And now, boss?" Jacob laughed at the informality. "Now I take this lesson with me." He looked around one last time and took a deep breath. "I thought that numbers and reports told me everything I needed to know, but it's not enough to look from above. Sometimes you need to be on the ground." Connor smiled, nodding. Megan appeared beside him, holding a cup of coffee. "If you ever need a disguise again, you know where to find a good hiding spot," she joked. Jacob took the coffee, laughing. "I'll remember that." He gave the restaurant one last look before leaving. knowing that even though his visit had ended, the change that began there would continue. Back at the office, Jacob faced his desk full of reports, graphs, and spreadsheets. For years, those numbers had meant everything to him, indicators of growth, efficiency, profit. But now he knew there was something those documents could never show, what was really happening inside his snack bars. He picked up the phone and began listing immediate actions. He would speak with the regional managers, establish a new evaluation system based not only on performance, but also on the quality of the work environment. He would create an anonymous channel for employees to report abuses and ensure that each unit had a true leader, not a tyrant like Rick. This time, it wasn't just about fixing a problem. He wanted to build something better. Before ending the day, he received an email from Megan. Just 2 sentences, but enough to make him smile. The restaurant is different. Now it feels good to work here. Jacob leaned back in his chair and took a deep breath. He knew there was still much to do, that he would probably encounter other Ricks along the way, and that not everything would change overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was looking at his company the right way. Not as a CEO analyzing numbers, but as a leader caring for the people who made his business exist. He closed his laptop and left the office with one certainty: this was just the first of many undercover visits.